Hearing will come to order. We are reconvened. Sorry about the delay, but we should be able to finish the hearing without having any more breaks for votes. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You obviously run a little faster than I do from the last series of votes, but I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the assistance for U.S. victims of terrorism abroad. And I'd also like to thank our witnesses here today for your willingness to help this committee with its work. Ms. Singer, Mr. Schwartz, and Mr. Roth, I'd like to extend our deepest appreciation on both sides of the aisle for your testimony here today. And as always, our thoughts and prayers remain with you and your families for the unimaginable pain and loss that you've endured. We also commend you for your dedication and continued work on behalf of U.S. victims of overseas terrorism. In the wake of 9/11, a succession of horrific terrorist attacks targeting or affecting U.S. citizens abroad occurred around the world. These included devastating bombings and other violence in Israel that injured and killed Americans, as well as terrorist attacks in Bali, Saudi Arabia, India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. In light of this threat of terrorism against U.S. citizens abroad, Congress established the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism in December of 2004 to, quote, ensure that the investigation and prosecution of deaths of American citizens overseas are a high priority within the Department of Justice, close quote. Pursuant to the implementing memorandum issued by U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales in May of 2005, the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, or OVT, I'll try not to use that acronym, is responsible for monitoring investigations and prosecutions relating to terrorist attacks against Americans abroad. The Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism also works with the FBI, the United States Attorney General's offices, and other components within the Department of Justice to safeguard the rights of U.S. citizens, victims, and their families. As noted by then-Attorney Gonzales, the FBI is the leading U.S. agency for terrorism investigation involving U.S. citizens. The Department of Justice Criminal Division and its 93 U.S. attorneys are primarily in charge of terrorism-related prosecutions, along with the National Security Division's effort to combat terrorism. As evidenced by recent events, the mission of the OVT remains critical in the face of relentless terrorism plots and attacks perpetrated by the Islamic State, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and other terrorist organizations worldwide. Just last week, I arrived in Istanbul, Turkey on an overnight oversight delegation only 4 days after a suicide bombing occurred in the city's Sultanahmet Square, an area heavily frequented by international tourists. I had been there previously with my family, my wife and daughter. I also traveled to Beirut, Lebanon, the site of a double suicide bombing in November 2005 that killed 2 American citizens and a permanent U.S. resident. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security-sponsored National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism reports that over 100 Americans were killed by terrorist violence worldwide between September 11, 2001 and 2014. In addition, the State Department recently estimated that approximately 7.6 million Americans are living abroad. More than 70 million Americans travel internationally every year. We must make every effort to ensure that the U.S. victims of overseas terrorism and their families are afforded the justice they deserve. To this end, it's imperative that we conduct meaningful oversight of the Department of Justice victims assistance process in order to identify additional steps that we could take to facilitate this important mission. I would note that Congress recently enacted a bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill that establishes a new United States Victim of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. This fund may be authorized up to $20 million to certain U.S. victims in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. Again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to hear from Ms. Singer, Mr. Schwartz, and Mr. Roth on their experiences with this process. I'll also look forward to discussing with all of our witnesses how we can address existing challenges to assisting U.S. victims of terrorism abroad and their families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We will now recognize our panel of witnesses. Pleased to welcome Mr. Brad Wigman, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, National Security Division, U.S. Department of Justice, Ms. Sari Singer, founder and director of Strength to Strength and a victim of terrorism herself, Mr. Peter Schwartz, uncle to a victim of terrorism, and Mr. Arnold Roth, father to a victim of terrorism. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All witnesses answer in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, or if I've talked with some of the witnesses, please do the best you can. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Wigman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about the Department of Justice's efforts to seek justice for U.S. victims of Palestinian terrorism in Israel. Protecting Americans from acts of terrorism and ensuring that those who commit such acts are brought to justice is the Department's highest priority. DOJ's agents, analysts, and prosecutors use every available resource and appropriate tool to disrupt terrorist plots and to investigate and prosecute terrorists. As we perform our mission, the American victims of terrorism are always foremost in our thoughts. Our hearts are with them and their families, relatives, and friends who've endured so much pain and suffering because of horrific attacks. We will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to ensure that those responsible for these attacks are held accountable, no matter where the attack occurred and no matter how long it takes. This past year, we brought charges in scores of international terrorism-related cases, reflecting the serious and diverse terrorist threats that we face today, from al-Qaeda and its affiliates to ISIL to homegrown violent extremists who are inspired by such groups. For more than 10 years, we've had an Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism. The mission of OVT is to ensure that where Americans are killed or injured in terrorist attacks overseas, investigation and prosecution remain a high priority, and the rights of victims and their families are honored and respected. OVT's operational assistance is focused principally on supporting Americans, victims, when cases are tried in foreign criminal justice systems, as is ordinarily the case in overseas attacks. Its work complements that of FBI's Office for Victim Assistance and the Victim Witness Coordinators in U.S. Attorney's offices, which have a more domestic focus. There are a number of different services OVT provides to victims, and I'd be happy to talk about those in greater detail today. Now, I know this committee is particularly interested in how we support American victims of Palestinian terrorism in Israel. Terrorist attacks, unfortunately, are all too common in Israel. Many Americans have been injured or killed in these attacks, along with Israeli nationals and others. Seeking to ensure that justice is done in each and every case in which an American is harmed is our top priority, whether the attacks occur in the United States, in Israel, or anywhere else around the world. The nationality of the terrorist or the group with which he or she may be affiliated is not relevant to our interest in the case. Over the years, the Department of Justice has brought some cases against individuals affiliated with Palestinian terrorist groups. For example, we have prosecuted more than a dozen individuals associated with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad for financing or otherwise facilitating terrorist activities or committing related offenses. We have also prosecuted Palestinian terrorists who engaged in attacks that killed or injured Americans outside of Israel. Now, to be sure, these cases do not involve any of the recent attacks within Israel, but they do evidence the Department's commitment to investigating and prosecuting terrorist activities by Palestinian terror groups where possible. The Department of Justice also has a number of open investigations regarding overseas terrorist attacks committed in Israel and in other countries that have harmed Americans. While I cannot discuss these investigations today or the facts of specific cases, it's important to note that the absence of public charges associated with a particular overseas attack does not mean that there are no charges or that no such charges will be brought. And successful U.S. prosecution can occur and has occurred many years after an attack and after an individual is released from a foreign prison. Of course, a U.S. prosecution is not the only way a terrorist can be brought to justice, nor is it the only means by which to protect our national security. Often, a foreign prosecution is the best or only available option, and if so, we work with foreign authorities to support such prosecutions as necessary. Israeli authorities have successfully investigated and prosecuted many individuals in connection with terrorist attacks that have harmed Americans. Some of these terrorists have been sentenced to multiple life sentences or extensive jail time in Israeli prisons. Sometimes Israeli authorities have pursued a military response rather than or in addition to a prosecution, and the terrorists have been killed. It is to be expected that Israel will ordinarily take the lead in investigating and prosecuting terrorist attacks against its nationals that occur on its territory, just as we do here in the United States and as many other countries do. The Department of Justice has provided support and assistance to scores of Americans victimized by terrorism in Israel in cases investigated and prosecuted by Israeli authorities. OVT provides information to victims about their rights in the Israeli criminal and military justice systems and the charges, hearing dates, verdicts, and sentences in such cases. We have provided financial and logistical support for victims living in the United States to travel to Israel to attend court proceedings. Our staff has also accompanied victims to court in Israel to assist them with their participation. We also coordinate a program that has enabled U.S. victims of attacks in Israel to obtain reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses associated with the attacks. Now, the fact that foreign governments most often prosecute terrorist activities that occur in their countries does not mean that the Department of Justice does not also pursue such cases. We do, and we have successfully done so many times. But there are often significant impediments to bringing prosecutions in the United States for attacks that occur overseas. These obstacles include obtaining necessary cooperation from foreign governments, gathering evidence overseas that will be admissible in a U.S. court, and apprehending and extraditing defendants. I'd be happy to discuss some of these challenges that we may confront in these cases today. In closing, I can certainly understand the frustration of some of the families that the Department of Justice has not prosecuted more cases involving terrorist attacks against Americans in Israel. And we certainly share the concern about Israel's recent releases of prisoners who harmed Americans, a step the United States urged Israel not to take. The Department is committed to making every effort to bring appropriate charges against those released prisoners who are responsible for attacks in Israel that included American victims. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Singer. You're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today and share with you my personal story, which is the story of thousands of Americans, people living in Israel and around the globe who have felt the brutal impact of Islamic terrorism. My name is Sari Singer. I'm the founder and director of Strength to Strength, and I'm the daughter of New Jersey State Senator Robert Singer. I was taught that the little things in life make the biggest difference, but I never understood the impact of the most minute details. A missed bus, seconds shaved off a marathon, a seat change, even a blink of an eye. I sit before you today as a survivor of a terrorist attack because of a series of split-second decisions that left 16 people dead and many others injured, including myself. When a terrorist attack occurs, the smallest details determine the outcome of everyone within range, and it's those fated moments that haunt victims for the rest of their lives. September 11, 2001 was a turning point for me. I worked near the World Trade Center, but overslept that morning. While my colleagues were running for their lives, I was uptown watching the towers burn and the murder of thousands of Americans on television. Within 3 months, I quit my job and moved to Israel and volunteered with organizations assisting victims of terrorism. My personal 9/11 came on June 11, 2003, the day I boarded bus number 14 in Jerusalem and barely escaped with my life. It is now 12 and a half years since that horrific attack, and the memories are still fresh in my mind. When I close my eyes, I am brought back to that day and shudder as my mind wanders into the alternate endings, each scenario increasingly terrifying. I was meeting a friend for dinner and boarded the bus. I chose an empty seat by the window. I always preferred the aisle seat, but that day I didn't, and I lived. The woman in the aisle seat next to me did not. I remember the sounds of crushing metal and the shockwave as the explosion tore through the bus. I remember shutting my eyes, an instinct which saved my sight. And I remember the moment of silence that followed the blast, a silence so frightening, the silence of those who were dead in every seat around me. I screamed. I screamed so loud that a stranger who had heard the blast from 3 blocks away ran toward the mangled, burning bus and pulled me out. I will never forget the old woman who held me as I was burned, bleeding, and frightened. I will never forget the kindness and love that was shown to me by those I had known my entire life and by those whom I had never met. My injuries were extensive. Shrapnel went through my left shoulder, breaking my clavicle bone. Both my eardrums were blown from the impact of the blast. My hair was burned, my face was bruised, my legs badly cut, and I have shrapnel in my mouth that is inoperable, that will remain with me the rest of my life. Days after the attack, I was told that the terrorist was 2 people away from me, and all those seated and standing around me were killed on impact. A busload of innocent civilians boarded the bus that day, and a suicide bomber injured over 100 of us and murdered 16 innocent people, including American citizen Alan Beer, originally from Cleveland, Ohio. An attack happens in an instant, but the impact lasts a lifetime. I established the organization Strength to Strength to create a support environment for victims, both survivors and bereaved family members. We are part of a global network bringing victims of terrorism together, working with organizations in various countries coming from different backgrounds and religions. It's difficult to find anything positive or any semblance of meaning in an act of terror. The act of maiming or murdering another person to support a political or religious agenda is not one that I will ever understand. We must do everything to make sure no more lives are ruined by terror, and we must remember that victims need support from their family, friends, community, and especially their government. While the physical injuries I endured were difficult, nothing compares to the long-term psychological impact. Finding justice is something that is vital in dealing with the long-term impact of what I and others have been through. In 2004, Congress passed the Coby-Mindel Act, which funded a special office within the U.S. Department of Justice to advocate on behalf of American victims of terrorism and tasked them with not only helping families with various expenses resulting from terrorist attacks, but to actively investigate those crimes and help bring the perpetrators to justice. While the office has been responsive in helping families with the former, and the civil servants who work at the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism undoubtedly have good intentions, Congress has hoped that the Department of Justice would take an active role in investigating, extraditing, and prosecuting terrorists who kill Americans overseas has come up against a harsh reality. Since Congress passed the Coby-Mindel Act, the only serious counterterrorism effort I've seen relating to my terrorist attack and dozens like it has come from 2 private civil suits I joined against Arab Bank of Jordan and National Westminster Bank in Britain. The case brought against Arab Bank led directly to a regulatory investigation by the U.S. Treasury Department of Arab Bank's New York branch and culminated in a jury verdict in 2014 finding the bank liable for 24 Hamas terrorist attacks, including the terrorist attack that injured me. The case against NatWest Bank is still pending, but it already has resulted in the bank closing the accounts of a U.S. specially designated global terrorist, Interpol, whose accounts remain active for years despite U.S. diplomatic efforts. I don't expect perfect justice, and I fully realize that the federal government cannot bring every terrorist to justice. But the government's track record in extraditing or even seeking extradition of Palestinian terrorists who have murdered American citizens is non-existent. One example is Ahmed Mustafa Salah Hamad, part of a Hamas cell that murdered American Howard Goldstein in June 2003, who was sentenced to 7 life sentences by Israel. He was released from prison as part of the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange. He has since been linked by Israeli authorities to a fatal June 29, 2015 attack in Israel. I love my country. America has always been a great country that has created a safe haven for citizens and refugees. I grew up believing that my country would be there for me and protect me no matter where I was in the world. These last years have left me feeling let down, and I want to believe again, the way I always did, that my country is protecting me and not the people who sent a teenager strapped up with a bomb to blow me up. Please, for all of us who've had our lives disrupted, restore our faith that our government is on our side. In closing, thank you, Chairman DeSantis, for making this hearing a priority and being a voice for so many American victims of Palestinian terrorism. Thank you for standing up for us and making sure that we know we're not alone and that we're not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartz, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing and for allowing me to testify. My name is Peter Schwartz, and I am the proud uncle of Ezra Schwartz of Sharon, Massachusetts. Ezra was a sweet and fun-loving kid. He was a great skier and baseball player and an avid football fan. He had a sharp mind, was a strong chess player, and enjoyed reading. He had a special talent for engaging those on the margins or in need, the nervous young camper, the mediocre athlete at the baseball tryouts, the elderly woman carrying groceries. Ezra graduated high school and had been accepted to the business program at Rutgers, which he was excited to attend this fall. But he decided to take a gap year in Israel on a program that mixed learning with community service. He was popular and happy, enjoying his year, doing good works, and looking forward to college. On November 19, 2015, just over 2 months ago, Ezra and some friends went to do some volunteer work on a memorial park that ironically, honored the memories of 3 boys who were kidnapped and killed by a Palestinian terrorist the year before, one of whom, Naftali Frankel, was an American citizen. The van that Ezra and his friends were in was caught in rush hour traffic at the Gush Etzion junction just south of Jerusalem, and at some point, Ezra put his head down against the window and went to sleep. Muhammad Abed al-Basit Harub, a 21-year-old Palestinian from a small West Bank village, spent at least 2 years planning and preparing to kill as many Jews as possible. With the assistance of his brothers and at least one friend, Harub purchased 2 guns and many rounds of ammunition for over $10,000. Harub chose his own birthday, November 19th, to go searching for a place with enough Jews to kill. When he arrived at the Gush Etzion traffic jam in which Ezra and his friends were stuck, he took out his gun and started spraying the waiting cars with bullets, killing 3 people, including Ezra, before being apprehended. Ezra was shot in the head, and in an instant, all of the beautiful things that he was and everything that he would ever become was gone forever. It is simply not possible to describe the magnitude of this loss and the impact that it has had on our family without sounding cliché, but it is excruciating and profound and overwhelming and visceral. His absence assaults you from every direction, from his sweet face staring at you from the family photos on the wall, from his name on the label of the skiing and sporting equipment sitting unused in the closet, from his adorable first-grade artwork, from the empty seat at the table, from the birthday text that never arrives, and even from the happy milestones of his friends and peers whose future graduations and weddings will be tinged with a little bit of sadness, knowing that Ezra won't be there to share them and won't have similar milestones of his own, but will be forever frozen at 18 years old. All of us in the family now have an awful highlight reel playing over and over in our heads. For me, it includes getting the news from my brother, telling my son that his cousin is dead, telling my parents that their grandson is dead, seeing Ezra's siblings and parents around his coffin, and seeing my brother, who I love so dearly and unconditionally, in unimaginable pain that I can never comfort. And then you remember that all of this terrible pain and loss is not the result of some tragic accident or unfortunate illness, but rather it was a deliberate and premeditated act by someone who dreamed of causing this suffering. Our family has tried to focus on Ezra's wonderful but all too brief life and has avoided wading into the surrounding politics. But there is nothing political or controversial about saying that the deliberate killing of innocent civilians for ideological, political, or religious reasons is abhorrent and inhuman, and it is just as wrong in Israel or in Gush Etzion as it is in Paris or Mali or London or Lower Manhattan. There is no context or explanation that makes Ezra's murder or Palestinian terrorism any bit less repugnant than any other terrorism in any other place, and there is no reason that it should warrant any less condemnation or reaction from every civilized citizen or country on earth. In fact, the need for a strong U.S. response to terrorism in Israel is even greater, considering how many Americans live, study, and travel there, that it is such a frequent, now literally daily, target of terrorists, and that it is our strongest ally in the Middle East, and the only one with which we share fundamental values like religious tolerance and democracy. Since Ezra's death, the U.S. government has been extremely supportive of our family. Condolence calls from President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry were deeply meaningful and appreciated, and representatives of OVT, IDVRP, and the FBI have been in touch and sympathetic. That said, we are not aware of what, if any, U.S. actions have been undertaken to investigate this case, and we still have many unanswered questions about the attack that claimed Ezra's life and what role our government can play in answering them. For example, how did a 21-year-old Palestinian from a small West Bank village obtain more than $10,000 to purchase firearms and ammunition? Did Harub receive funding from outside groups such as Hamas or Islamic Jihad? Will others, including Harub's brothers, one of whom supplied him with the car he used in the attack, be charged as accomplices in the case? It is our hope that the FBI and the legal team at OVT will take an active interest in this case and work with their Israeli counterparts to answer these questions and ensure that Mr. Harub, his accomplices, and other terrorists who harm Americans abroad face justice and when convicted, remain behind bars. Thank you for this opportunity and for all that you do to support and protect U.S. citizens and their families in Israel and around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Roth, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll start again. Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, distinguished members of the committee and staffers of the committee, I admire the ability you have to call an event like this and to project the message that things can be done. It is the antithesis of the feelings that people like me, people who are the parents of a child who's been murdered or the partner of a loved one whose life has been stolen from us, feel, because nothing is more disempowering and shattering and silencing than being the survivor of an act of terrorism directed at people who you love. I was reminded of just how that power works driving here. I'm not a frequent visitor to Washington, but I was in a cab that went through the mall and we passed a memorial. It's a memorial as it happens to World War II, but it makes material and concrete the reality that behind all of those numbers and those ciphers and those tombstones, there were lives and people. It's a sense that has been cheated from us. If terrorism has any overriding goal, it is to depersonalize and to anonymize and to turn into statistics both the victims and the people who lived with and loved those victims. And I appreciate the opportunity that this hearing presents to push back and to say what is on the minds of victims like me, and there are thousands of us. We seek, by every possible means, to do something that is so difficult to explain that I can only throw the words at you, to reassert the humanity of the people whose lives have been stolen by the cruel terrorists. In this case, my daughter Maggie. I'm not going to spend any time here telling you what a wonderful life she lived and what a beautiful person she was and how much good she brought into the world and how empty and silent is the void that she left behind her. But I am going to say that having stolen that life, the terrorists have left us, the families and the loved ones, no choice but to do everything we possibly can to associate the memory of that wonderful life with things that are good. And I'm struck by the reality as I look around the other victim families in Israel where I live, at how energetically they pursue the doing of good things, perhaps the erection of a shelf of books, perhaps a shelter at a bus stop, perhaps a foundation like the one that my wife and I set up that helps people who have a disabled child. You see actions like this going on all the time, and they are not intended to draw attention to the people who are doing them. They're intended to draw attention to the lives that have been so unfairly stolen. And with the image of Malki, my daughter, who was 15, right before my eyes as I say these words to you, I realize that I want you to know that I'm never going to be again able to talk about terrorism in the way perhaps that others can. I see things, my wife sees things, my children see things, that somehow the people who report about terrorism and the people who prosecute the terrorists probably never see. There are resonances and absences and failures to do things that choke us. I don't remember thinking those thoughts until I had to wake up one morning and see my daughter's slippers next to the bed that she was never going to be sleeping in again. When I put together my written submission, which I hope will be read, I felt that I needed to speak about practical things that this committee could do. And they came down to wanting you to be aware of the incitement and the enablement, two key words which may not be self-evident. The incitement that goes on day after day to anyone who has eyes and ears by the Palestinian Arab society with which we are striving to live in peace, and which to a great extent is folded into the society in which I and my family live. The incitement that comes from the very highest levels of that society, right down to ordinary tweets emanating from people who live in that society. The hatred, the urging on to more and bigger and better acts of terrorism is simply unbearable. And as long as it goes on, and it does go on, We're wasting our time and our prayers in hoping that these problems will go away. They will not go away. Likewise, the enablement. Enablement has to do with money, and money is where Washington comes into the picture. When a person is sentenced to prison and then comes out after perhaps many years, life is pretty difficult. You have problems re-emerging into society and you probably don't have any money. It's hard for me to convey to you how untrue that is in the case of thousands of Palestinian Arab convicted terrorists. Of course, I'm thinking about the people, the gang who were involved in the murder of my daughter. And I'm also thinking in particular of the engineer of the massacre, who was a young woman who's been mentioned here in the chairman's thoughtful introductory words. These people have come out with more money than they ever had in their lives. They've come out with a more exalted position in society than they ever dreamed of. If any of us imagines that the process that produces those results is conducive to bringing an end to this death cult, this engagement with murder as a redemptive act, then think more carefully. In relation to the work that's being done by the DOJ, I've made the point several times in my written remarks that there has been unfailing courtesy, responsiveness and attention, but very little in the way of results. I could make the statement stronger, but I choose not to. This is not a human material problem. This is not a goodwill problem. But there is a problem. It's clear that there's a problem. It's not clear where the problem is coming from. If this committee does anything, and I know that there is a desire to do something, let it be to focus on where the problem is. Should the OVT or the DOJ address these issues of incitement and enablement and the particularly bizarre way in which the word terrorism has been removed from the lexicon of many of the people engaged in looking at terrorism and trying to stop terrorism? Euphemisms are being used as if they were machine guns, but they're not machine guns, but they do make people lose focus. In some ways, they are the real enemy here. Terror is now a legitimate career option for hundreds of thousands of the people living on the other side of the boundary from where I live. Unless we engage with that issue and recognize where it's brought us, not much is going to happen. I don't know why the Kingdom of Jordan continues to appear at the very top of the State Department's survey on terrorism as America's close ally. I don't know why that is. I don't know why people who haven't lost a child don't see how far away, which is not very far away, everybody here in my country, in Australia, in New Zealand, wherever, are from experiencing the kind of unthinkable loss that has turned my family's life upside down. I'm sorry that I've gone on beyond the time, but I want to mention very briefly something that President Obama said last week on the day that this meeting was supposed to take place, on the 27th of January. He did something that was startling to me. He quoted a Hebrew expression, which is, of course, taken from the Bible. In the course of speaking at the Israeli Embassy on Holocaust Memorial Day, he used the expression tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. 3 words, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Tzedek is the Hebrew word for justice. It's also the Hebrew word for righteousness. And it's repeated twice in that sentence in Deuteronomy 16. Tzedek, justice, cannot be done in a vacuum. Justice requires to be done in a righteous fashion. Doing it right is how we ensure that all of us, not just the victims, but all of us, can continue to live and exist as coherent and constructive communities and societies. I can't explain why the OVT's record is what it is, but I do urge everyone, including the key people inside the OVT, to look carefully into their hearts and see whether justice is being done and whether it's justice, justice, as the biblical phrase says, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I think the witness statements were excellent. I really appreciate you guys coming here, and I think that anybody watching this, I think it was very, very powerful, and we appreciate it. Mr. Wigman, the committee has counted that since '93, at least 64 Americans have been killed, as well as 2 unborn children, and 91 have been wounded by terrorists in Israel and the disputed territories. How many terrorists who have killed or wounded Americans in Israel or the disputed territories has the United States indicted, extradited, or prosecuted during this time period?
I think the answer is none.
Okay. How many terrorists who have killed or wounded Americans anywhere else overseas has the United States indicted, extradited, or prosecuted?
I don't have an exact figure for
Probably
you.
be a decent-sized number, though, correct?
There's a significant number, yes.
Okay. Does the DOJ plan to prosecute any of the terrorism cases committed by Palestinian terrorism in Israel and the disputed territories?
So we have a number of open investigations. I can't comment further on the status
Do
of
you know
these
how many, though?
investigations. I can't give you that number.
Why not?
I don't have the number, and I don't think we want to comment exactly, because the more we say about the number of investigations we have, the more we tell the bad guys who we're trying to get. So.
Well, I get, look, I get the ongoing investigation. I think we would like a sense of whether this is a substantial effort or not. And so, maybe you don't give us an exact number, but we want to know that the progress is being made. I mean, your opening statement, you said that these prosecutions, when Americans are killed by terrorists overseas, including in Israel, that was the highest priority and that there should be no stone left unturned. And I understand when you're talking about foreign jurisdictions, and you alluded to some of the issues that arise, and I think that point is well taken, but when it's 0 for 64, I think you see some people who've been affected negatively wonder, what exactly is the department doing within this particular aspect of terrorism that occurs in Israel. And let me ask you particularly, Mr. Roth alluded to the engineer of the terrorist attack that killed his daughter. This is an individual who really is, since being released in a prisoner exchange, has been open and notorious, is on TV with Hamas. Is that something that the department is monitoring, and is there any plans to try to seek justice in that case?
Yeah, so absolutely. Let me address that. I think the Tamimi case is the case you're referring to, and she, along with 2 others, I think, were prosecuted originally by the Israelis. As I said in my opening statement, most of the cases that occur in Israel are prosecuted in the Israeli system, and so she was sentenced to a long prison term. She was then released in 2011. In conjunction with the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange. This was something that we opposed. We had advised the Israeli government that we opposed this release, but they did that anyway. They're a sovereign government. We couldn't block that. Since that time, we've made clear that we intend to pursue any available charge that we can, either in this case or in all the other cases involving released prisoners. That was really a kind of a game changer for us, the prisoner release, and we're really concerned about all of those folks that have American victims on their hands. So absolutely, we're pursuing.
I think so.
Pursuing all of those cases, including that one.
And I appreciate it. Senator Inhofe in 2012 wrote and requested the status, and basically we were in the same holding pattern. So I appreciate those words, but I think, as Mr. Ross said, when OVT was created, the idea was you're going to help the victims and then hopefully facilitate within the DOJ that these prosecutions are happening, and they're not. Now, it's been alleged that the reason that the DOJ does not prosecute the Palestinian terrorists who harm Americans in Israel, the disputed territories, is that the Department of Justice is concerned that such prosecutions will harm efforts to promote the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, or that it will actually harm the Palestinian Authority. So let me ask you straight up, is that a consideration of the Department of Justice?
I can assure you that is absolutely not the case.
And has the State Department ever made arguments to the Department of Justice to handle some of the Palestinian terrorism cases differently than you may normally handle, say, a terrorism case in Asia?
Absolutely not. The State Department has nothing to say about cases that we bring, whether in Palestinian territories related to these cases or not. So it absolutely makes 0 difference to us whether the terrorist attack occurred in Israel, whether it's a Palestinian terrorist group, whether it's ISIL, Al-Qaeda. They're all the same to us. We want to protect Americans regardless of who they've been victimized by.
So you mentioned the 2011 prisoner releases that included terrorists who harmed Americans. Now, when that was undertaken, you said the administration opposed it. Did the State Department work with Israel to maybe seek extradition of any of the people who were being released against our wishes?
So again, I can't comment on any particular investigation, but what I can say is that since that prisoner release, we have kind of redoubled our efforts on those investigations, and we're working really hard with the Israelis. We've gotten increased cooperation from the Israeli government since those releases, and to the extent that we can bring charges in any of those cases, we intend to do so. And again, I would caution the committee not to assume that because, as I said in my opening statement, that we don't have any public charges doesn't necessarily mean
I don't
that
think we do assume that. I just
Right.
think it's been a long, this has been something that's been going on for a long time, and I think there's a lot of concern, understandable concern, about the lack of results. And so that is really what we're focused on, is the results. Now, some have said that if you have a situation where a terrorist who kills Americans in Israel is prosecuted by the Israelis, and then they're later released in a prisoner exchange or release, that somehow if we were to prosecute them here, that would trigger double jeopardy. Is that the department's position?
Absolutely not. We have prosecuted people who have been released from prison before. Sometimes it takes us a while. One prominent case is an older case, actually a case involving a Palestinian terrorist who hijacked an airliner in Pakistan. He spent, I think, 8, 10 years in a Pakistani prison. Then he was released, made his way to another country, and it was, I think, more 10, 12, 15 years later that we were able finally to apprehend the person, prosecuted him in 2004, and he's got a 60-year sentence today. So we have prosecuted people who've been released from prison before, and certainly nothing in the Israeli prison release would be any different. We fully intend to pursue charges in any of those cases if we can.
Let me just conclude by asking, and I realize, you're here representing the department, the Kobe Mendel and the OVT. This was all over 10 years ago. We've had different administrations, different parties. We've had Congress, different parties, and so it's been it's not that there's one person to blame, but when you see that 0 cases have been brought, and you see the victims of terrorism, their families seeking justice. Do you understand the frustration without seeing any tangible results, even understanding that some of these cases are very difficult?
I certainly understand the impatience and frustration. The only things I could say are, the reasons are, in some of those 64 cases that you talked about, there were Israeli prosecutions, and Israel is a very capable and effective and aggressive prosecution regime. So a lot of those prosecutions were brought by the Israelis, and that's the same as we would do here. We have had foreign nationals injured in terrorist attacks here, whether it's the 9/11 attacks or the Boston Marathon bombing. There were foreign nationals in both of those attacks who were killed and injured. Those attacks are going to be prosecuted in the United States. The foreign governments, we try to work with them, give them information and so forth about the case, but the same is true in Israel. The Paris bombing was prosecuted or will be pursued and investigated by the French because it's on their territory. There was an American killed in that attack. So I totally get it. I understand the frustration and impatience of the victims, but in general, most terrorism cases around the world are prosecuted where they occur. That doesn't mean that we don't try to bring extraterritorial cases when we can, but there are some really tough issues in bringing these cases. As I mentioned in my opening, we have to have the cooperation.
And I appreciate all that, but the tough issues, you got to confront those. When you say leave no stone unturned, that means you got to deal with them head on. So I appreciate you being here. I've gone over, and so let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch.
Okay. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. Indeed, heartbreaking and very, very powerful. I want to go through, Mr. Wegman, the procedure that has to be followed. I also serve as the top Democrat on the task force on terrorist financing, so I spend a lot of time in the Middle East and Pakistan, a lot of time in Israel, fair amount of time. Just came back last week from Lebanon, the Syrian border, Turkey, Jordan, and part of our efforts there are on the terrorist financing piece, is to take the power away from these terrorist groups, to try to deny them the resources that they use to perpetrate these terrorist acts. and to deny them access to the legitimate financial system. I'm also very familiar with previous terrorist attacks, Khobar Towers, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, the multiple attacks in Karachi, Pakistan, and Islamabad, obviously several attacks in Beirut. Mr. Wegman, the process here, if there is an attack in a foreign country on U.S. citizens, I think you said this before, in the first instance, the prosecution is solely, well, let's back up a little bit. In all of those cases that I just mentioned, to my knowledge, it was the FBI that goes in first. Is that correct? Are they the lead agency for the United States?
For the United States, they are, but obviously if it's an attack overseas, the real leader is the government of the place.
No, I'm talking about,
yes.
I realize that.
The FBI, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
For us, the lead,
Yes.
the lead agency for us.
Absolutely.
So, and in the first instance, our role in terms of assisting any prosecution by the host country, and as you said, the Israelis handle it, the Lebanese handle it, the Kenyans handle it. It is an investigation that is by the host country, and we're allowed to assist. Is that how it normally goes?
Yes, in many cases, we do provide assistance if we have information that is relevant to the attack, or we can provide, sometimes we're helping with the victims actually provide information what they have on the attack. So yes, there's ways that we can assist, and we do. Sometimes it's just helping them in their own investigative techniques. So there's a lot of cases in which we provide support. The other more capable governments, it's less likely that we would provide assistance because they're already quite capable on their own. So it really depends on the country.
Okay. Are there any opportunities for us to have shared prosecution agreements or something like that, or a treaty in place where we can actually, get in initially with the investigation and sort of expedite and enhance the prosecutions in foreign countries? Do we have anything like that?
It really depends on the country and the facts of the case. There's some cases, let's say an African country, some that you mentioned, Kenya and Uganda, I know. There are cases where they really need our help. They're not used to doing complex counterterrorism prosecutions. We send FBI teams in very early and prosecutors as well to help investigate the case, and we're there at a very early stage. In contrast, in another case, let's say it's an attack in France, they already have a very sophisticated cadre of investigators and prosecutors. We typically would provide information, let's say electronic information on accounts that terrorists may have been using or things like that, and we provide assistance. But it's not the same level of support that we provide in a less developed country.
And I know this is probably country specific, but what is the experience that you've had in terms of getting cooperation from some of the host countries where an attack has occurred involving a U.S. citizen?
So it's really all over the map. Some countries really welcome our cooperation and ask for it. Other countries are not as cooperative and won't give us information, won't allow us in on the ground, won't allow us to go in and interview witnesses or do anything like that. So it really runs the gamut.
Mr. Schwartz's testimony highlights the balance of understanding the sensitive nature of investigations and intelligence gathering on the one hand, but also on the other, the victims and families deserve answers to the questions. So you can see how this is tremendously frustrating to families in this case, and also all those who are similarly situated, and there are hundreds. I'd like to get your comment on this, particularly given that your division, the National Security Division, not only oversees OVT, but also is more generally responsible for enhancing law enforcement and intelligence efforts to combat international terrorism. How do we divide those priorities in terms of trying to inform the families, but also dealing with maybe sensitive issues with the host countries?
So we have an obligation, and it's our mission anyway, to give the families as much information as possible about the status of the investigations. to the extent we can do so without interfering with or impeding those investigations. So that's one of the main functions of our Office for Victims, is to keep the victims apprised of the status of investigations. We have lots of meetings with victims, their families, to tell them what's going on. There are limits sometimes as to how much we can say, but we say a lot more than we can say publicly. We develop confidential relationships with the victims and can share quite a bit of information with them. We try to obtain information if it's a case that's being prosecuted overseas from the foreign government in a way that the victim might not be able to, and share that information to the extent that we can as well. So the victims actually have statutory rights to be informed to the extent possible, and we try to maximize that to the extent that we can. There are some limits to what we can say because we don't want to jeopardize the case in any particular case, but we do try to share as much as we can.
Is there anything that Congress can do? Do you feel that you're inhibited in any way by statutory provisions that we have put in place that that could be mitigated in order to help you be more cooperative with victims' families?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel like, our office does, we can always use more resources. We have a small office, so there's always more that could be done in theory, but I don't think there are any legal prohibitions on our relationship with the victims.
Okay. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair notes the presence of the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, a member of the full committee, and without objection, Mr. Meadows is welcome to fully participate in today's hearing. Without objection, it's so ordered. And that being done, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to say thank you for holding this hearing, and obviously it is critical, and it's the reason why I made it a priority to be here, not only to support your efforts, but I know that you have followed very closely not only the conflict that is going on in the Middle East and the terrorism threat, but really bringing justice to the victims, and so I want to just say thank you. Mr. Wegman, my concern, Winston Churchill has one of my favorite quotes, and it is, no matter how beautiful the strategy, we must occasionally look at the results. And the results are not encouraging. In fact, when you were talking about how your office helps the victims, I watched people, and many of the people at your table were rolling their eyes and not agreeing with your premise on helping and keeping them informed. So I guess one of the questions I have for you is I know there are a number of services that are out there in terms of helping victims' families, whether it's travel or counseling or any of those things. Are those all available to victims' families?
I know one program that we operate is called the International Terrorism Victims Expense Reimbursement Program. So that's a program to reimburse families for.
But there's multiple agencies. You kind of become the point of contact because for these families. So, Mr. Schwartz, have they reached out to you to let you know all of those?
I have been in contact, and we have been contacted. Who made the initial contacts and sort of who reached out to who? We were fortunate to have sources of information from many different directions, but I would echo Mr. Roth that there's been no shortage of sympathy and accessibility of resources for us.
But not a whole lot in terms of results from a prosecution standpoint.
Certainly not results, but it has been very early, and there's been some effort to keep us apprised. But if there is any American involvement with the investigation, we're as yet unaware of that.
So, Mr. Wegman, let's talk to that, because my wife and I just recently got back from Israel. One of the most chilling things that I think I sat in a courtroom in Israel where 6 terrorists were being tried, had a Hamas-paid attorney, had 6 of them in leg irons. Several were committed to ISIS, several committed to Hamas, and with pride almost like they were turning in a paper on a job well done. They were smiling and joking with their family in the courtroom. I made a commitment at that particular time to say that not only do we have to bring justice, but we have to bring it quickly. And so I guess the question I have is, knowing that there's the pride of these terrorists, and many of them feel like that they get off so easily, why are the Israelis better at bringing them to court than we are here in the United States? Is it a lack of resources? Because if it is, you need to speak up now.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's a lack of resources. It's just they're the ones on the ground who are, let's say an attack occurs in Jerusalem. They're the ones going to the scene. They're collecting the forensic information in a way that they would do that in Israel, but may not be the way that we would have to do it in the United States to ensure that it's admitted in a U.S.
So they're not coordinating with you properly? Is that because, I mean, I'll reach out to the Israeli government if that's the...
So the typical case, it might be, 5 or 6 Israelis are killed, and then 1 American is killed, and perhaps a Palestinian or someone from a third country. The Israelis are going to take the lead in that country. They're not going to, in general, have multiple multi-country investigations right at the very initial stage. They probably haven't even identified the nationalities of the victims at stake, much less have a chance to contact the foreign governments and get them involved. So they're going to take to just as we would do here in the United States in investigating a case. The FBI is going to do the investigation, is not going to be promptly inviting in, for example, in the Boston Marathon bombing, there was a Chinese national that was killed. We're not going to be inviting the Chinese government in to help us conduct that investigation. So I think the Israelis do it the way that most of other countries would do it, but they're doing it under Israeli priorities and under Israeli laws that are not going to necessarily lead to us being able to introduce the evidence that they collect in a U.S. court. The way they get statements from witnesses and so forth can also be in a manner that we can't use them in a U.S. court. So don't get me wrong, we can overcome some of these obstacles. I just wanted you to be aware that there are particular challenges in these overseas cases.
So when are you going to overcome these obstacles? Because the chairman pointed out, from a standpoint of the results, as Winston Churchill would say, is we haven't seen a whole lot of them. And so the point of your office is what?
Well, our office really, again, to be clear, it's to ensure that justice is done, whether it's done...
So as long as the Israelis do it, you're fine?
We support all tools. We have whole programs at Department of Justice that are designed to build the capacity of foreign countries to prosecute terrorists. We work with governments
Mr.
all
Roth
over the world.
shouldn't expect any further action from DOJ?
I wouldn't say that in his particular case. I'm just saying that if the Israelis were to sentence the attackers in that case to life sentences or adequate terms of imprisonment, that's a way to protect our national security.
So who determines what's adequate?
Accountability. Well, I don't know. We'd have to evaluate that. And when they get out of prison...
Who determines it?
Well,
is it Mr. Roth or is it you? Or who determines what's adequate?
If they get out of prison and we think it's not enough, then we can pursue charges at that time. Well, we have done so in many cases. And that's one of the things that's happened in these release cases in 2011, which is they were released prematurely as part of a prisoner swap. We're not happy with that at all. And we are actively pursuing those cases, I can assure you.
So, Mr. Chairman, you know that you have my full support. I will continue to work with you as you continue to illuminate this particular situation. I thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Wigman, one of the purported rationales for the Kobe-Mandel Act was for OVT to, quote, determine the reasons for the absence of indictments of terrorists in some regions, and obviously Israel was one of those. Has the DOJ actually done that and determined specific reasons why Israel would not be getting prosecutions while other overseas victims in other areas of the world do? Is there a memo, or does it outline the reasons for that?
I have to say I'm not familiar with that. It said the reasons why there are no charges.
Yeah, determine the reasons for the absence of indictments of terrorists in some regions. And I think this would be obviously one of those regions where the indictments would be lacking.
Of U.S. charges, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the reasons would be along the lines that we've talked about, although those aren't unique to Israel. The challenges that we have would be in any country, the ones I identified. It's just that in some cases we're able to overcome those and others not.
Ms. Singer, do you believe that OVT is doing what it was set out to do?
So I definitely have a relationship that started off very strong with the office. I was in touch with them very much. But with all due respect to Mr. Wegman, I never was even told any information about my attackers, about those that planned and carried out the attack. I know that the terrorist, died in the attack, but I wasn't told any other information until I signed on to the lawsuits, that I was on the Arab Bank lawsuit and National Westminster Bank. And once I signed there, the lawyers were then able to tell me that the terrorists that were the masterminds of my attack were currently in jail. But any information that I tried to seek further from that, from the office, there was none for me. And my biggest concern and fear is what happens when those that have carried out my attack are released in a swap, in a prisoner exchange, and then they're just going to be left to go to other countries, and even countries that we have extradition treaties with, they won't be extradited and brought here and be put on trial for the murder of Americans and injured Americans, which are many, many more than the number 64. And I don't want to preclude in saying that not only are those numbers, but there are families and extended families and communities that are directly impacted by those murders. And our family members are the ones that suffer long-term with us, especially the survivors that live with those memories every day. And justice for us and accountability and validating what we went through is something that we need to see more of. We need to make sure that those that have carried out these attacks, if they're being let out of jail because of an exchange, that their lives are not going to go back as if they're heroes, but that they're really going to be prosecuted against in this country and be made an example, that no one should be carrying out attacks against Americans anywhere in the world. And I think it's really important that there is more movement and more measures taken to, especially with the ones that we've talked about from the Shalit deal, there are a number of those with American blood on their hand that could be taken and prosecuted. And again, for me, I've never received any significant information in this area with regard to assistance of ITVRP and other areas of psychological, physical. The immediate needs for a victim after an attack, the office is very good with in terms of, medical needs and reimbursement. But it's really the justice portion of it that I have some issues with in terms of really wanting to find out what happened and where these people are, and that they're not going to be released soon.
Do you know, Mr. Wigman, the status? We had the murders in Gutzet-Zion, I think in November of 2015. There was an American that was killed. Are the Israelis currently prosecuting that case, to your knowledge?
What was the name of the case you mentioned again?
There were a handful of people. It was, when was it? Probably mid-November of 2015. We can get you the information if you can let us. It was the most recent, I believe. It was Schwartz.
Yeah. So yes, the Israelis have opened a prosecution in that case and brought charges in that case. And I think there are 3 others. There have been 7. There's been an uptick in violence in Israel recently, and there's been a number of Americans injured or killed in those attacks. And I think there are 7 cases, and of those 7 recent cases involving Americans, there are 4 that the Israelis have brought charges, and we're in touch with and contacted the victims and their families in each of those cases and have offered our support services.
Okay, good. Mr. Roth, your testimony was great. I mean, you really did a good job with that. It was well done, so thank you for that. And I think you bring up a good point. I mean, obviously, when something like this happens, I mean, we want justice, but I think everyone would prefer that this stuff just not happen to begin with. And you talked about the incitement, and you talked about just the lucrative nature of terrorism in this society. And American funds are obviously a part of propping up the Palestinian Authority, even with the unity government with Hamas. So, I mean, just what is your advice to us about how we use tax dollars with respect to the Palestinian Authority?
Look for the return on investment, if I can just put that in the simplest of terms. But I'm not very good at giving advice, certainly not in this context. I'm a little bit better at asking questions. And I have to say, the one question that is rattling around in my brain after hearing some of the comments that have been made here and focusing on the work of the OVT, what it says it does, what it describes as being its goals, what its highest priorities are, I'm struck by a triviality, and I mentioned it in my written submission. The brochure that's handed out to families who are the clientele of the OVT has gone through at least 2 different versions, and you have to look very carefully to see the difference, because they look identical. But the difference between the 2 is that in one of them, the earlier one, the first one, there's a section, a significant section, headed, "What are the rights of victims?" And in a later version, that paragraph has simply been removed. The guidelines haven't changed, nothing's changed, but somebody somewhere, and as I say, all I know is to ask questions, has made the decision that the rights of the victims perhaps isn't the same kind of priority now as it was then. Now, I'm not establishing that as a conclusion at all. I'm only asking questions. But as a lawyer, and I've practiced law as long as most people here in this room, I know that you can't simplify the legal process without doing damage to the integrity of the process. The fact is, things can take time. But speaking as a client of the lawyers now, my family and I haven't heard a thing for 4 years. I've learned a lot about the perpetrators of the murder of my daughter, but it's come through the legal offices of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. That's not consistent with the self-description of the OVT. I have, and I mean this sincerely, the utmost empathy with the people doing the job, and I know how tough it is to be a lawyer with unreasonable demands of oversight committees and difficult clients. But we've seen nothing. And the nothing is rattling around in my brain as a question, not as a conclusion.
Well, thank you. Mr. Lynch, do you have anything further?
Sure.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wigman, the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, OVT, that's in your department, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And then we have the Office of Victims of Crimes. Is that in your department as well?
It's in the Department of Justice, not in my division, but it's in the criminal division.
And that's regarding victims' expenses, reimbursement programs, and that?
That's correct.
Then we have the FBI has an Office of Victims Assistance straight up, right?
Correct.
And that's totally different?
Yes.
Ms. Singer, you've worked with dozens of Americans affected by overseas terrorism, and you yourself, obviously, are a victim of a bombing in Israel. In your testimony, you said that you thought that many victims that you work with have never even heard of OVT or its services. Is that your testimony here today?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just, it seems scattered. I know that these different agencies were created in response to different issues, but you got people at state, you got people with you at DOJ, then you got people at FBI, and you'd think that with all those agencies, if they were doing what they should be doing, victims and their families should at least they shouldn't be waiting 4 years without information, especially when, as you say, it's out there on Twitter and other media platforms. I'm just wondering if there's a way to consolidate this and do it in a way that actually serves the people. I think we're running into a problem where, it's everybody's job, so nobody's doing it. That's the problem. And I'm just wondering if we have accountability with one agency and it's their job, and we can hold them accountable if it doesn't happen. I just think that it works in harmony with all of our incentives here, which is you want to get as much information to the victims' families as possible. Right now, it seems like it's 3 or 4 different agencies have this responsibility, and nobody's really doing it to the extent that it needs to be done.
So let me just comment first that you're absolutely right that in keeping the victims informed and serving in that liaison function is job one. If we're not doing that, we're not doing our jobs. In other words, being a liaison with the victims, keeping them informed of developments in their case, telling them as much as we can about the scope of the investigation, if charges are brought, keeping them apprised of the progress of the prosecution, telling them their rights. As Mr. Roth said, these are statutory mandates that Congress has created, and we have an obligation to fulfill. So we needed to try to do that in every single case, and we work hard to do that, to reach out to the victims. But if there's a case where that's not happening, then we need to correct that. In terms of having the different offices, they really do perform different functions. OVT was actually the latecomer that Congress created in 2005. The Office of Victims Assistance at FBI is the kind of what I would analogize to the first responder. They're the ones who are often the first ones to contact victims. They're providing some of those immediate social services and things like that to victims to assist them. And they also have a much broader mandate. It's not just terrorism, so it's any crime. They're protecting all crime victims, so they have a much broader and different mandate. Then you have victim witness coordinators at U.S. attorneys' offices. I know this can be confusing, but just bear with me just a minute. Those folks are helping when there's a U.S. prosecution. So if it's brought in Illinois or Georgia or California, the U.S. attorney's office will have someone assigned to work with the victims in conjunction with those cases. So the gap that OVT fills is for these overseas cases. Okay, so how do we help people know their rights in Israel or France or Brazil or wherever the case may be, understand what their rights are under foreign law and how they can interface and help them participate in those proceedings and provide victim impact statements and do the other things that we do. So that's why we have different offices, and we try to have all these offices work together as appropriate.
Okay. I've exhausted my time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief. Mr. Wegman, I asked earlier if it was lack of funding or how can we help? So here's my request of you and my challenge to you. It seems curious that I would have two people at a particular witness table that would indicate that there is a failure to communicate on not only a regular basis, but they're finding out more information, whether it's a lawsuit or Twitter or Facebook, than they are from the appropriate agency. You just described the agencies and what they did, and I'm confused. I mean, it's like spaghetti, and you don't know where to start and where to stop. And so here's what my request of you is: can you put together a task force within DOJ that makes a commitment to all victims, not just the 3 that we have here today, to provide regular updates, to let them know what their rights are, to put it back in a brochure, to make sure that every victim's family gets something as a disclosure that says you can count on this, you can count on this, and you can count on this. And if you're not getting that, then let your member of Congress know, or let us know, or the appropriate person know. Are you willing to commit today to get that available to the hundreds of victims that are out there and victims' families, and make a commitment to this committee, the chairman and the ranking member today?
That's our mission. That's what we should be doing, as I said.
I understand that's your mission, but let me just tell you,
Yeah.
you're failing at part of your mission, Mr. Wegman. And so I'm asking you, are you willing to make a commitment? And if so, by what date can this committee count on that?
So you're saying to create a task force to...
It doesn't even have to be a task force. Just get it done where victims can understand what their rights are and what's available to them, and where they can count on it, so they don't have to have an attorney figure out the legalese that you just went through.
That's absolutely our commitment to the victims, and so I can make that commitment today, that we owe that to the victims, and I'm certainly happy, right after this hearing, we can chat. If you feel like you're not getting what you need from our office, we can meet, we can set up, arrange meetings for you, whatever you guys want, because we do owe that to the victims.
But here's what I don't want to happen, is one conversation that happens because you're feeling the heat today because the chairman called this particular hearing. What I want it to be is a report back to the chairman and say, this is the process of how we're going to keep all victims and their families informed and of their rights from here on out. Can you do that within the next 120 days?
We can absolutely get you something on that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for coming. I think the testimony from our victims and family members was phenomenal. I think it was very, very powerful. I think it was necessary, and I think it's going to help, the Department of Justice perform better, at this function. But we face, as Americans, a global jihad, and Israel is ground zero for that fight. And when we have Americans visiting, studying, living in Israel, and they're killed or wounded by terrorists, we're not going to forget that. We can't forget that. And we will get justice, and we'll be patient if we need to be, but we are not going to let justice be denied. So thank you guys for attending, and this hearing is now adjourned.